Good evening and welcome to this important discussion of the role of church and state. I'm Tracy with KOGmissions.com and I will be your host tonight, and I will be on with John Truitt and Carlos Xavier discussing this important topic. The format for this evening's discussion will be as follows. We will have a 5-minute opening for each of our gentlemen and then a 40-minute discussion back and forth. Then we will close the discussion with 5-minute closing statements. And after that, there will be a 30-minute audience Q&A. So if you're out there watching, please type your questions into the chat and make it clear that it is a question and to whom you're addressing the question, and keep them succinct. I know this discussion is very timely, and with everything that's happening in the world, many Christians are wondering if they should be involved in politics and state matters where they live and around the world. And so please remember that we are seeking to know and understand what the Bible teaches on this matter. And I encourage you to be good Bereans and search the scriptures to see if what is said tonight is true. And to those of you watching and chatting out there, please do keep your questions and comments to the topic at hand, which is the role of church and state. And I ask also that you would please leave current political opinions and comments at the door. And let's show these gentlemen respect and listen to what they have to say on tonight's topic. So, Carlos, before we begin, would you please share your websites and contact information with our audience?
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Tracy, for moderating this. So, yes, before we start, I'd like to show you the website. Good evening, John.
Hi, Carlos. Hi, Tracy.
Hi, John.
Good to see you. Since I saw you, Tracy, it's nice to see you.
Likewise.
Yes, thank you for taking the time, John. And this is the website, ChristEnemyLove.com, one of many websites from our ministry, Restoration Fellowship. And you can follow the discussion. If you click on discussions, there should be a chat, and there we are. So thanks, everyone, for taking the time. I also would recommend you check out our other links, especially the history section. There's a section there up to the 5th century. And the view of this website is that Jesus practiced love of enemy to his own death. And the New Testament presents this teaching as an unqualified commandment to be obeyed by his followers. That's according to his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. And this is in stark contrast to Jesus' own Jewish law and tradition, known as the Torah, or the law of Moses, regarding holy war in the Old Testament and lethal self-defense. So this site will explore I believe, what's become an alternative Christian view, really, but that's what we're going to discuss tonight. So thank you for that, Tracy.
All righty. Well, let me introduce John and Carlos to you. So first of all, John Truitt. He's a pastor with Christian Virtual Fellowship, the online church arm of Allegiance to the King Ministries. He became a Christian at age 14 and a one God believer at age 21. John owns and operates a computer service business based in Paducah, Kentucky, where he lives with his wife, Lisa, and their 3 children. And John, would you like to begin with your opening 5-minute statement, please?
Sure. So there's a lot that you could say about this subject, and Carlos and I have talked a little bit about the kind of different aspects and things that you could discuss about this. But I think as a basis, it's good to start with how God has set up different realms of authority. So in the Bible, we find that throughout history, God establishes several categories of authority. Really, one of the first ones is marriage and family, and those are a whole category in themselves, where God has given certain realms of authority, responsibilities, and those kinds of things, and that's its own thing. And then there's civil authority, which God first initiates in the covenant with Noah and in Genesis 9, and that has its own thing. And we see that throughout the scriptures in operation, and certainly we get some interesting insight into that realm of authority in Romans 13. And then there's the the authority within the church, and that's a whole different realm of authority, and there again, responsibilities and requirements and duties and all that kind of stuff, and authorities. We see Paul talking about sometimes that, you know, he has authority as an apostle with the churches under his care, and you know, certainly we see that, you know, elders / pastors / overseers have, you know, authority within that context. And so within each of these different realms of authority that God has established, there's certain rights and privileges and responsibilities, and all of these different things were given to mankind by God, each one of them, including civil authority. So where you know, and especially in this context, I'm sure for the most part people understand the idea of church authority, and that God has given authority within the church, and I don't know. There's controversial things about that, certainly, but that people, you know, can discuss and debate. But in terms of government authority, we see in Romans 13 that there's this establishment by God of civil authority for the purpose of keeping the peace and avenging evil, for dealing with evil, and so they're called, that authority itself is called a servant of God, right? A minister of God, and so mankind participates in that. We see in other places where God set up you know, national boundaries, tribal national boundaries, and expects mankind to fulfill that responsibility that he's given to them in terms of civil authority, in terms of keeping the peace and dealing with evil and wrongdoing. And so in a broad sense, each of these things, marriage and family and church and civil authority, all of us participate in that. And there isn't anybody who doesn't participate. In fact, if you think that you haven't participated in that, or you're trying not to participate in it, you're still participating in it. You certainly have a family, you had parents, so you, in that sense, you may not have ever been married. That may be the one area that you may not have participated in directly, but you were in a family where there was a marriage. And if you're a Christian, then you're participating within the church context. Certainly sometimes people try and avoid that, but you know, we know that's wrong to do. And we all participate in one way or another in terms of civil authority. So for instance, in Romans 13, it talks about our responsibility in the relationship we have with one another in support of civil authority to do its God-given and godly job. We pay taxes, and it's a good thing to do that. We're supposed to do that. Now, I would also say that in addressing the issue of abuse of that, because you know, civil authorities frequently abuse their God-given authority, but the reality is that happens in all the different realms of authority. Probably all of us have experienced abuse of authority in a church context, probably in a family context. You think about, God gave sex to mankind. How often does that get abused? Right, all the time, and conducted in a way that God never intended. And so, just because that happens all the time with sex doesn't mean that it's a bad thing, or that it's not a godly thing. It is. And civil authority is the same way. Understanding all of that, then we can understand why it is that even though Jesus tells us to love our enemies, there's nothing wrong with participation in the God-given authority of the government, of civil authority at whatever level. It would be wrong to participate, you know, especially directly, in something that went against God's commands, right? So if I become a police officer, that I'm doing the will of God. I'm doing God's will in terms of civil authority if I carry out that purpose in a godly way. But if I if I abuse it for whatever reason, or if I'm asked, more importantly, if I'm asked to abuse it, I need to refuse that, right? And even if that costs me, even if I suffer because of that, I need to not do that. So a good example would be in terms of becoming a soldier. Certainly, the civil authority has the responsibility to protect the people of its nation. And if an aggressor comes in and attacks the nation, it's a godly purpose for those soldiers to defend that nation. But it's not a godly purpose for the soldiers who are attacking the nation, right? So the soldiers who are defending their nation, they're perfectly within a godly framework to do that. They're carrying out God's will in doing that. The ones who are attacking it are not. They're going against God's will. And if a Christian is in that context, they should refuse to do so, even if they suffer for it, even unto death, because we're supposed to obey God rather than man. So I would say, in terms of sort of the basic foundation of all that, that's kind of the perspective I'm coming from.
All right. Well, thank you, John. And next up is Carlos. Carlos grew up as an agnostic before converting to the Christian Unitarian point of view in 2006. He lives with his wife in Fayetteville, Georgia, and currently works for Restoration Fellowship as their online media manager for the following websites: thehumanjesus.org, christenemylove.com, jesuskingdomgospel.com. Carlos also hosts a bi-weekly Q&A with Sir Anthony Buzzard, and he has also hosted notable evangelical authors like J.R. Daniel Kirk, Larry Hurtado, and Jewish historian Richard Rubenstein. Carlos has debated Trinitarian apologists like Jonathan McLatchie and Mark Stengler Jr. And so, Carlos, if you would start your 5-minute opening statement, please.
All right. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, John, once again for taking the time for this discussion. And it's more of a discussion, by the way, folks, not an actual debate. But I'd like to open up with the words of the Apostle Paul himself. So this is the topic at hand this evening. He says, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which is from God. The authorities that exist have been appointed by God. Consequently, or therefore, whoever resists authority is opposing what God has set in place. Those who do so will bring judgment on themselves, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be afraid of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will have his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not carry the sword in vain. He is God's servant, an agent of retribution to the wrongdoer. I believe there's a false premise created when we separate what Paul says here at the beginning of chapter 13 from the immediate and wider context of the letter, and that's starting in the last chapter, chapter 12. So I believe this leads many Christians into believing that they can serve both the state and their church at the same time. Now, just to be clear, by serving the state, I'm referring to the political and law enforcement wing of the state. So be it the police, the military, and even some parts of the political machine. And this changes the role of the Christian from a servant to an overlord, from a loving peacemaker to a threatening enforcer. Some time ago, I made a list contrasting the role of the Christian with the state. I hope you can see that. So there you have that immediate wider context. So in Romans 12, verses 14 to 21, Paul says, do not curse, but bless. Do not live in disharmony. Do not repay evil for evil. Do not wage war. Do not take revenge. Do not neglect your enemy. Do not let evil take over you, but conquer it with good. As you can see, there's a lot of do nots. And then in that chapter we just read in the beginning of 13, do punish your enemies. Do take revenge via the sword. Do scare your enemies. There's a lot of do's there. So you see the clear contrast, a lot of don'ts and a lot of do's. So it would be impossible for me to read Paul in the beginning of Romans 13 as saying something like, let every person be subject to Christians in government, for there is no Christian government except from God, and only those Christian nations that exist have been instituted by God. I think most Christians assume this reading because they think Paul is describing a quote unquote good government and not bad authorities or governments that have been established by God. But the fact is that Paul was referring to both benign and evil systems. Take, for example, the fact that Paul was writing these commandments in Romans 13 under the Roman government led by the Emperor Nero, who to this day, many Christians see as an antichrist figure. Furthermore, Paul commands each and every Christian to obey the Caesar, the emperor, by not resisting or opposing, as he says here. Instead, Paul says, the Christian is to honor that said emperor or Caesar and even pray for others in government. This obviously does not mean you honor the evils, by the way, they do, but we as Christians pray to God the Father for them so that we may live quiet and peaceful lives. Paul says that to Timothy in 1 Timothy 2:2. Lastly, I want you to think about the following repercussions. If Paul really meant to equate the role of the church with that of the state in these two chapters in Romans 12 and 13, then Christians would be responsible not only for imprisoning other Christians, but sometimes having to kill them as well. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, Carlos. And now we are going to move on to our 40-minute discussion time, and I will leave the two of you to discuss back and forth the role of church and state.
All right. Thank you, Tracy.
So, Carlos,
Yes.
that's probably some stuff that would be good for me to kind of share with you to help, in terms of understanding, between us. In Romans 13, I don't really believe it's talking about governments. I think it's talking about authority, that God has established a certain kind of authority. Because when you look at the underlying words, it's the words for authority, right? Like it doesn't use the word kingdom and that kind of stuff. It certainly is carried out in those kinds of ways. It's carried out by government, and I think this is an important distinction. So I agree with you. For instance, I think the chapter break at 13:1 is a bad chapter break. That this is actually in the exact same context of the verses that just came before it. I think it's Paul answering the question of how does God mete out vengeance, right? So when it says in Romans 12, and he says in verse 19, never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay. The question is, okay, how does God do that? And he's answering that question in chapter 13. So I think, for one thing, on the one hand, I agree 100%. These contexts go together, and that we as Christians, in a general sense, are being told, here's how you need to be, and don't take vengeance. You need to carry out these things, and then, but it leaves the question. Okay, well then, if God is, if it's that vengeance is mine, I will repay. How does he do that? He does that through his servant, the authority of civil government. That's the way I see that. And then the other thing is, in terms of the thing that you brought up, here's how I would see this, where you said that if we're supposed to be one way here in Romans 12, but then these guys are in a very different way. So in one sense, you're supposed to be loving your enemy, and in this other sense, you're supposed to be punishing these evildoers, including putting them to death, kind of thing. How can how can those two things, go together? That I would give the example. I go back to sex, and we are told not to have sex, right? Don't go around having sex. But once you get married and you come into that authority, you can have sex within the context of that authority. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? That there's this similar kind of transition occurring there, which is that, yes, it's true that Christians in a general, they're never supposed to take vengeance, right? You're not supposed to take vengeance. And honestly, it's hard for us to relate to that in our modern culture because people don't tend to do that most of the time. Whereas it was a rampant problem in ancient cultures. It was a rampant problem in the United States in the 1800s and the early 1900s, where people, Hatfields and McCoys and stuff like that. But it certainly, we're not supposed to do that. But this servant of God is in this other realm of authority. That is what God is supposed to do. And when you go into that realm, just like in the sex before marriage and after marriage, once you go into that realm, now you have that God-given authority, even if you are a Christian, to carry out the will of God. That's how I would see that.
No, thank you. And you're very clear on where you stand, which is, I believe, where most self-professed Christians have stood for some time. I'll just share here, if you don't mind, John, a quote from Luther. Luther in the Reformation in 1523, he wrote a work called On Governmental Authority. He says in part, "You ask whether a Christian too may bear the temporal sword and punish the wicked. Since Christ's words do not resist evil, are so clear and definite." Okay, this is why some say that you cannot bear it among Christians or hold it over them, for they do not need it. The question, therefore, must be referred to the other group, the non-Christians, whether you may bear it there in a Christian manner. They say, the non-Christians, it is very beneficial and essential for the whole world and for your neighbor. Therefore, if you see that there is a lack of hangmen, right, executioners, constables, what I guess we would call policemen, policewomen, judges, lords, princes, politicians, and you, now he's talking to Christians here, find that you are qualified, you should offer your services and seek the position, that the essential governmental authority may not be despised and become enfeebled or weakened or perish. So you're probably familiar with these quotes. This is what came to be known as the Two Kingdoms Doctrine, I believe it's called. So here is the problem, that when we read Paul in context, right, to Romans 13, so Romans 12, and then obviously the words of Paul are echoing his Lord, Jesus, the Lord Messiah, and Jesus' unqualified statement, love your enemy. So the issue has to do with how are we loving our enemies if we are not just imprisoning them, hurting them, in trying to imprison them, but let alone killing them. Now, you asked a very good question, and this is the question. So how does God, during this present evil age, keep a lid on evil, keep a lid on just everything, going bananas? Well, Paul says that he has this authority. And you're right. I guess we read into, let's say, verse 1 there, governing authorities. We read the government. We read the state. Yes. The Greek doesn't say as government as such. It doesn't say state as such. But the authorities there have been understood as the immediate state, the government, because of the role that God has set for them, which is mainly to bear the sword for the state, to avenge the state, right? And the problem is that, so as Christians, we're told to love our enemies without qualification. In other words, it doesn't say love your enemy except if they're trying to invade your home country, your state, or right. I don't think there's a qualification there, and it's not about well, if we have to keep the peace, I guess it's better for a Christian to keep the peace by bearing the sword, which sometimes means killing evil people, wicked people. And that's obviously, I don't think that's consistent with the principle that of, first of all, loving your enemy, and then obviously avenging. We're not supposed to avenge ourselves. And there's an interesting contrast here, by the way, just quickly, John, and I'll give you the mic, with verse 19, and you picked up on it, right? Do not avenge yourselves, right? Leave that to God. But then it would be awkward, if not, totally contradictory to me anyway, for then Paul to turn around and say, actually, you can avenge yourselves by using the sword of the said governing authority.
So, a couple of things. I don't see the contradiction, because for this reason, that the God-given authority to punish the wicked, and it uses the term wrath and carry out vengeance, basically, on evildoers. It calls it good, right? That's a good thing. It's not a bad thing, right? It's a good thing. And because it was given by God, it's ordained by God, it's and it's called good by God, you can't really put it into the category of it's unloving, right? So it's, in a general sense. Now, I don't want to say, I'm not going to say that, well, then it applies to all Christians, because it doesn't, right? Because it's a very specific thing. It's in this category of civil authority. And so when you have God-given authority and it's called good, but it's doing this thing that he just told, us not to do, then the way to interpret that is to recognize that authority, which is what he's telling them to do, right? Telling them, you're not supposed to do this. God has given a means for this to occur. So, for instance, if we were in the area where, I'm forgetting the name of the town off the top of my head, where Cornelius was. And so Cornelius becomes a Christian. Now, he's a centurion. It's his job to keep the peace where he is. And he certainly would have kept that job after becoming a Christian, because he couldn't have left that job. It was good for him to carry out God's will in this context of authority. It's very similar. If you go to 1 Corinthians 7, and it says, now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, right? And obviously he means sexually. But because of sexual immoralities, each man is to have his own wife. So when you change the authoritative context, it's not okay for a Christian to touch a woman, right? For a Christian man to sexually touch a woman, unless they're married. So to me, it's that same transition. It's not okay for a Christian to take vengeance out on the wicked unless they're in the context of they're actually a minister of God in that context, a servant of God in that context, like Cornelius was, or Sergius Paulus, for instance, would be another one. So I don't really, to me, I don't think it's sticky in this area at all for Christians. I think it's pretty clear that, yes, this is a good thing. It's given by God. It's called good. And if a Christian is doing it, they have that authority as well. And it is good. And it is loving in a greater context to carry out that will of God than just the context of loving your enemy. Because there's a bigger picture. There's multiple things competing in those situations, just like with David and the showbread, there were multiple laws going against each other in that situation, but the greater one applied, which was not letting them starve, right? I think that where it gets way trickier for Christians to navigate this particular subject is the actual carrying out of loving your enemy, right? And I think we do it very, very poorly.
Right. Well, let's see. I would say this. So you gave a talk, and I would ask people to go watch your talk on this. It's called Use of Force, what a Christian must consider. That's on
our YouTube channel. So it's youtube.com/Christian Virtual Fellowship.
Right. So just type in the YouTube Use of Force, John Truitt, and so on. You'll find it. Now, let me take our conversation this way. Let me agree with you on some things that you said in your talk, which actually surprised me, right? Even though you hold to what I would call a traditional view of the so-called church and state, that Christians can, and it sounds like you're saying we should.
I'm sorry. That was one of the other things that I wanted to make sure was clear. I don't think that way. I don't think in terms of that it would be better for it to be all Christians in the government or anything like that. I don't think that's a true thing. I think that if a Christian feels called in that way, then there's nothing wrong with that. But that I also think that if a Christian feels like they shouldn't do that in their own conscience, then they shouldn't, right? Like if they feel like they should not go into the military because they might be put into a position, or a police officer, then yeah, they should not do that.
Right. So you wouldn't compel a Christian to, obviously not force,
no.
Which obviously we agree we shouldn't force anything on anyone, really, right? Yeah. We're trying to persuade here. So two contrasting views of this issue. But in your talk, you said, let's see, I have it here. You said our default should be trying to win the enemy by giving up our rights. I think I might be paraphrasing you a little bit, but is that
a good paraphrase?
Right. Now, I would agree with that. I actually talk about I've been looking at this matter since I became a Christian, almost 10 years now, maybe more. So, I've read a lot of books, and I don't have any degrees, by the way. I'm not a doctor in nonviolence or something like that.
No.
or like, right. Or like Dr. Richard Rubinstein, who I interviewed a couple of times. He's actually a PhD in conflict resolution. So, but, through the decade now that I've looked into this matter, when I teach on this, and I try and teach it as often as I can, because I think you can agree with me that we can have all the gifts, Paul says, right? We can be the most spiritual person in 1 Corinthians 13, but if we do not have love, we're nothing. We're dead, right? Inside. So love is key in all this. And I've talked about how we as humans, and I'm not, by the way, the perfect example of a non-violent or, pacifist person. We all struggle with this, but I've seen this as a default of violence button. You know what I mean? Like my first instinct, especially as a male, I don't mean to be sexist here, but is to counter a violent action against me or on my person with an equal and proportionate amount of violence. I mean, I think that's just the makeup of what we are. And when Jesus comes along, and in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, you have heard it said, let me just bring it up here. Let me read the words of the Lord here. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right? So that's that proportional violence. So you do violence to me, and I'll do the equal amount of violence to you. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. And then he goes into that very tough teaching about if someone slaps me and turn the other cheek and so on. If someone takes you to court, let them have everything. Really, I think Paul goes on to say, let yourself be defrauded.
Yeah.
He says at one point.
1 Corinthians 6.
Goodness, that's difficult, right? And then he talks about hating your enemy and so on there in verse 43 and so on. So we have a propensity of violence. We have a history of violence. So that's the default button we have. But when you say that in order to win the enemy, we have to give up our rights, what did you mean, or what do you mean by rights, quote unquote?
So I have another teaching that we recorded a few months ago that really delves into that picture. I'm trying to remember what the title of it is, but it was a few months ago. So if you look at the stuff around probably the October timeframe, somewhere September, October timeframe, the teaching is on that Jesus requires his disciples to give everything, including their own lives, right? The passage after passage after passage in the Gospels where Jesus is saying, you can't be my disciple unless you're willing to give up everything that you own, all of your relationships, your very own life, right? And that concept that you give up everything for him, right? And his commandment to love one another, right? That same thing that's what's going on throughout that, especially the first part of the Sermon on the Mount, where over and over again, he's telling them how to be salt and light, how to be the kingdom people, how to have righteousness greater than the Pharisees, and over again. So if you think about the first one, the murder, right? That if you're guilty of that, then you're guilty of this ultimate thing. But then he goes, but I tell you, if you're angry with your brother, then you're guilty of this already, right? And you go back to Cain. And James says the same thing in chapter 4, where Cain and Abel. Cain was envious of Abel, and then was angry with him and quarreled with him, and then killed him. So in God's mind, this is a process that begins with envy and jealousy and lust and stuff like that, and then it leads to fighting and quarreling, and it ends in murder. And so to God, it's just all that same thing. Well, what does Jesus say? Right? He says, in fact, let's read it in Matthew 7, because I think this is profound. You got it. Okay, that'll work.
What verse?
I'm sorry, did I say Matthew 7? I meant Matthew 5.
Oh, 5.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was what's 21, I believe.
How's that?
Yeah, I'll read it off your screen. You've heard that it was said to the ancients, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, will be subject to the Sanhedrin, but anyone who says, you fool, will be subject to the fire of hell. So now he's told us this principle. Now he's going to give us some practical application. And here's the practical application. So if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. I think most people read this as, I'm angry with my brother, so leave my gift at the altar and go be reconciled with my brother. But look at that. It doesn't actually say that. It's the opposite of that. It's the brother that's angry with you, right? So if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you. So it's actually your brother who is committing murder, right? He's the one who's in danger of the fires of hell, not you. And in this situation, Jesus is saying, go rescue your brother. Go rescue him from hell, right? Go rescue him from this sin that brings death. And in a lot of cases, you're probably going to have to give up something, right? You're going to have to give up to do that. because you're going to have to go, what if you didn't do anything wrong in that situation where you were actually in the right? Well, what's more important, you being right or saving your brother's soul? Well, I think saving your brother's soul is more important to Jesus, right? So that's what I mean by giving up your rights. And you can see that throughout this whole section where, yes, you have a right to defend yourself. You have that right. But it doesn't mean that you have to use it if you can save your brother, right? If you can save someone, maybe you don't use that right. It's really no different than when Paul says that he wasn't going to use his right of support with the Corinthians. He had that right, and there was nothing wrong with that right, except that in the situation, it was more important to give up that right and help the Corinthian believers to grow and mature in Christ. They needed that. And so we know that when, I've seen this in my interactions. I'm sure you've probably seen this. I'm sure most of the people watching this have seen this in your interactions. If you will not default to that use of my rights of you wronged me and I'm going to sue you and all that kind of stuff. If you give up that right to love that other person, it can have a very, very dramatic impact on them. I think in terms of, if you want to see that in a cultural setting where you get a really good picture, is in Les Miserables, in the scene where Jean something or other, where he's stolen from the priest, and the cops have caught him and brought him back to the priest, and the priest says, "You forgot these other things. I gave you those things, but you forgot these other things that I'm giving to you too." And he takes these other valuables and he sticks them in the bag. And the cops are like, "Oh, well, okay." The priest gave up his right in that was his property, right? That was the church's property. And he could have said, "Yes, he's a thief, take him to jail." But instead, he doesn't do that. He gives up that right and he loves him instead. And then the whole story after that is this man who's been so profoundly affected by the love of God that this priest displayed that his whole life changes. So yeah, we don't do a very good job of this, and we need to do a better job of this. We need to stop quarreling and fighting and, which James calls murder. We need to stop all that, and we need to recognize that Jesus has called us to give up our lives in order to save people. And sometimes you've got to give up rights for that. So that's that whole idea.
No, thank you. Well, look, I'm listening to you, and I'm trying to think how to practically follow what you just said if I am working as a policeman for the state, or even worse to me, as a soldier. So how do I totally agree with you. And I like that quote, that winning the enemy by giving up our rights. I think that is the Christian way. That is, if we call ourselves Christians, a follower of the Messiah and his teachings, I think that's spot on. I think that's what Paul's doing. There's a passage, as you know, in his letter to the Romans, he says, we are like sheep, sent to the slaughter. And I think that most of the Christian movement, the known Christian movement of the early centuries, at least up to the 5th century, were doing that. They were giving up their rights. The churches, the early councils, for however bad they were with their theology, we're non-Trinitarians and we don't agree with the Nicaea Council, the Constantinople Council, and so on, in terms of their theology. But it's interesting that in terms of their understanding of this topic, they were pretty much spot on. And that's why if I could ask people to once again look at the first 5 centuries here of the Christian movement. And I'll just give you an example. So if you click on the first century, you have the Didache, which is one of the earliest, if not the earliest known Christian document apart from the New Testament, and you have them reiterating the Sermon on the Mount, blessing, not cursing, and so on. And you have letters by, well-known so-called church fathers like Polycarp, now he that raised him from the dead will raise us also if we do his will, walk in his commandments, love the things which he loved, abstaining from all unrighteousness, covetousness, love of money, greed, evil speaking, false witness, not rendering evil for evil, and so on. And again, all these so-called early church fathers, they had this view of, okay, it's us, it's the church, and the Roman state will do what the Roman state will do. We will suffer the consequences sometimes of not bowing down to the Caesar. And you have the infamous Colosseums where, self-professed Christians were slaughtered, families. And the interesting thing about the councils, this particular councils, was that they even had what's known as canons or laws or orders for their churches, punishing any self-professed Christian who either went back into the military, or took up the sword again against a fellow human being, not just a fellow Christian. So again, the idea of giving up our rights, to me anyway, is just an impossibility in the world of the military or law enforcement. I myself, maybe I should have told you that I was in law enforcement for most of my adult life. I was in the security industry. I only became a Christian at 32 years of age. I'm 40, I forgot now, 6 now. And when I became a Christian and I just read the Bible, for the first time, and I read the Sermon on the Mount for the first time, it blew my mind. It was Christ calling me to a total shift in my worldview. Oh my goodness, I said to myself, I'm not supposed to do this anymore. Even though I wasn't even holding a weapon, I never worked in a position where I had to actually own a weapon. My conscience was still like, my goodness, I might be told to go against certain things that I see Christ, I see the apostles teaching, and that just, I can't do that. As difficult as it is. So one other thing, I think time is almost upon us. If I could get your comment on the military. So can you just go, I know you've taught this, but so how is killing for the state, right? And sometimes there's this so-called collateral damage in war. How can you do that as a Christian? How does that even? Yeah. Tell me your views on that, if you don't mind.
And hopefully, maybe I could take just a moment too after I answer this to address your other thing about police, because they're very different, realms. So what I believe is that, yes, in fact, I had a verse up here earlier that, let me find it. This is Acts 17:26, where Luke writes, "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and boundaries of their habitation." So if I recall correctly, he's quoting Paul there. So God has created these nations and set their boundaries, right? And you actually get that in the Old Testament. There's some really interesting stuff about angels in the Old Testament. But so this is a God thing to have these nations. That is something ordained by God. So it is good, right? If you're in a military role, your job is similar to the police, but on a national scale, right? That your job is keeping the peace which means not in terms of crimes happening in the nation, but crimes against the nation by another nation, right? That another nation has come along and has attacked your nation, is trying to take over your nation. It's a good and godly ordained thing for you to protect your nation, right? That's, that there's nothing wrong with that. But on the flip side, if you were a soldier in the attacking nation, that is totally outside of the will of God. And as a Christian, you would be obligated to refuse to do that. And you should do that. I don't know if I've said this yet, that if you are in a position as a police officer, a correctional officer, a prosecuting attorney, a judge, a probation officer, a soldier, whatever, a sailor, soldier, airman, whatever it is, in any of those kind of capacities, and you are asked by the government to do something that goes directly against the will of God. Let's say, for instance, you're in military intelligence and they want you to torture someone. Nope. You need to refuse to do that. And you need to, and if it means you suffer consequences because of it, then so be it. It's a good thing. Peter tells us that's a good thing in God's eyes, right? When we suffer for doing what's right. So in terms of a soldier, the boundaries of a nation are ordained by God, right? That a nation, it's not specific boundaries, but that a nation has boundaries, and that nation, it's right and good to protect the people of that nation from an aggressor. And so that's what I would say about a soldier is you have to ask yourself the question. And I think this can be difficult for soldiers, especially in modern times, is that the function that you're doing? Or are you doing something? Are you really being the aggressor? Are you the one who's going and attacking the sovereignty of that other nation? And that can get a little gray.
Yeah, let me ask you about let's see. So obviously a soldier is under orders of the state, right? And the state authorizes a just war, right? So the state says, the president, the prime minister, whatever country you're at, by the way, and they say, okay, this country, all right, but that country is a quote Christian country, right? So they're self-professed Christians.
I would probably, I think you would probably say this too. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. I don't think there's any such thing as a Christian country. I think there's countries that have lots of Christians in them, or maybe even are led by Christians.
Right.
But those are two very different realms. I don't think the civil authority is a Christian thing. It is God ordained, but it's not a new covenant thing.
Okay, then why would Christians even be involved with it if it's not a Christian institution?
I don't think marriage is a Christian institution. That's a God ordained thing that existed long before the new covenant. The same thing. It's that there are realms of authority outside of Christianity that human beings can and do participate in, including Christians.
Mm. Now, why do you think, John, that so I gave some of the history, and people, by the way, don't believe me, check it out. Check out your history. It's always good to have some history. Why do you think the Christian movement as a whole, would you agree that the Christian movement as a whole in the first at least 4 centuries did not seem to agree with your view that they were in the military and the government and so on?
I don't, that's one of those things where it's really, we have little bits and pieces. So you have the stuff that was left over. You don't really know what everybody thought or did. How many people were actually, because when we read the New Testament, there were people in government authority positions who became Christians, and there's no evidence that they stopped being, in those positions. In some cases, they couldn't have. because they were obligated to stay in those positions.
Well, we do have a lot of evidence, and if people, again, check it out for yourselves. But if you go, I've tried to collect all these quotes. So the evidence that we do have from these different groups, from Egypt, Northern Africa, Middle East, and so on.
Yeah, no, I don't want to suggest that they that this stuff isn't true or anything like that from all those quotes.
Well, my question is, what do you make of choosing as a group, right? As churches, what do you make of those churches that chose the path that now is obviously in the minority of minorities, that Christians should not get involved, and instead sometimes even suffer and sometimes even die, but not rendering service to the military or so on?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One, it was very different than in our society, where you had tremendous corruption in those institutions, and a lot of wickedness and evil in those institutions. So they were looking at a pretty different thing than, say, you would have looked at in terms of your job. Or I work a lot with law enforcement. We have a lot of prisons and jails that we work with, and sheriff's departments, police departments. And so I know a lot of police officers, and I know a lot of correctional officers. And I know a lot of really great people in that profession. That I know a lot of Christians. I know Christian ministers who are preachers that are police officers. They're very, very good people. And there was a real problem with that for a long time in the ancient world. So that's one thing. They're looking at a very different thing, and they're perceiving it in a very different way. The second thing I would say is that just because they did something doesn't make it right, right? If the New Testament said one thing and they're doing something else, well, then we know that they're wrong. But I don't think just because they did this, it makes them correct. However, I believe they were a heck of a lot more correct than the church that followed, right? So when you get into the 4th century on, for a millennia, that it went in the opposite direction. So you think about the pendulum swinging, as people talk about, the pendulum swung back too far the other way, right? Well, if right in the middle that's the right thing, that's the truth from God and his scriptures, and maybe they were over here a little bit before, they're a little off, but they're still pretty darn close to what Jesus was really wanting. Then when it swung back the other way, it went, it went off the deep end. And so I think the other thing is that you compare and contrast these two things and readily see that those first few centuries, they were much closer to what Jesus was trying to get people to do than the next number of centuries. Right. I do want to say, in terms of police, that you have, as a police officer, you have rights, right, as in your authority, and you can choose not to exercise those rights. So I'll give you a couple examples within the criminal system world.
The pandemic.
Yeah, a prosecuting attorney has the right to choose not to prosecute.
Sure.
Right? And so they have to weigh all the time, every day. They have to weigh the good in a lot of situations. So there's a I think it's on Netflix right now, a movie or something about a serial killer from the 1980s in Los Angeles called the Night Stalker. I grew up in Los Angeles, and I remember that. And
Me too. I was a street away from one of the murders.
Okay, so I remember I was a teenager, and I was like, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. And it would be wrong in that situation for a cop to just let him go, because he's gonna, he catches him, he's just gonna let him go. That would be evil of the cop to do. It would be evil for the prosecuting attorney not to prosecute, and evil for judge and jury, once found guilty, not to put him in prison. At the same time, there's lots and lots of opportunities, and those opportunities are utilized day in and day out by law enforcement and the judiciary every single day to show mercy, to show care for these people, to show them love. Sometimes it includes putting them in jail, because they need to, maybe it's a situation where they have a serious drug and alcohol addiction problem. And if you don't take them off the street, they won't get help, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity for a police officer to make a decision about their rights in terms of how they're going to do that in a loving way in those contexts.
Right.
Well, thank you,
Hi,
Jim.
Christi.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, did we go too long?
Well, it's about 10 minutes over, but that's okay. We have a few questions here.
Sure.
And so the first one for you, Carlos. What about the centurion with John the Baptist?
Right.
And John told him to repent of things and not stop being a soldier. And about Cornelius, and can you prove that he left his former life?
Yes, well, and then John can have his say. Actually, I'm glad that John didn't go that route. A lot of people who are for this alternative view, or what I call the traditional view, they say, but look, John the Baptist didn't say anything to the soldiers, Cornelius, and so on. But that's really an argument from silence, I would say, to the questioner. In other words, you cannot prove or disprove that the soldier, who became, well, in the case of John the Baptist, they simply, I believe, came up to him. I don't know if they became Christian. I don't know if they got baptized, etc. But I will say that, again, it's about consistency in our Christian living or a Christian walk, or however you want to look at it. In other words, if I'm a soldier, especially back then, right? You think it's bad now, Roman soldiers, go read the history books, what these people were told to do many times. And so it would be inconsistent to see Cornelius, for example, trying to continue to fulfill his duty as a soldier of that Roman state, which was wholly pagan, by the way. At least nowadays we have, self-professed Christians, and they try and be benign and so on. So we have a benign, or quote, good and good situation now. Back then it was evil through and through. And like I said, it's interesting. It's so revolutionary. And I think you can agree, John, what Paul writes, because Paul is writing under one of the most abhorrent authorities, governing authorities known to humanity. I mean, these people they didn't have football games. They had Colosseum games, throwing people to lions alive. And that was hey, let's go watch so-and-so get eaten up. So yeah, it's a sort of argument from silence, but the teachings of Jesus and later his apostles, Peter and so on, they tell me that it's inconsistent to continue in that profession. I mean, to say the least.
So John, do you have anything you would like to say in regards to that?
Sure. So I wouldn't, Carlos is right. I wouldn't use the John the Baptist situation to really do this, because grace and truth comes from Christ, not from John the Baptist. So yeah, it wasn't that John the Baptist was saying things that weren't true or good or whatever, but I want to base my foundation on Christ. And so I just wouldn't do that. What I would do is I would go to Cornelius and I would show this, because I think this is a good illustration of what I'm getting at, of how the authority is good and it's God given, and it can be used for good or it can be used for bad. And Christians participating in the good, that's good. Christians should never participate in the bad. So you take Cornelius, for instance. So Cornelius is a centurion, and so he's in the Roman military, but understand that the Roman military was the police. So he's essentially in a police role where he is. And so and we know from what we read, he was loving people in that position, right? He was doing good for the community and all that kind of stuff. So he was using his rights as a civil authority to carry out God's will in great ways, right? I'm sure that he punished evildoers and stuff like that, and that would be carrying out God's will too. If Cornelius had been transferred, let's say he had lived a number of years earlier, Well, actually, about the time that he lived was when the Romans went back and invaded Britain again, right? And, Julius Caesar had tried to do it and it didn't work out very well. So about 100 years later, they did it again and they were successful that time, right? So Cornelius was living about that time. So let's say his he gets transferred along with his legion to the legions that are going to go invade Britain. That would be wrong, right? Because that's being an aggressor going into another nation, right? Now, you can't do anything about, like, this is the United States of America, right? At one point, it was a different nation, and you could make the case that there were lots of little nations, little Native American nations all over the country, and Europeans came in and invaded it. Well, I can't do anything about that. I didn't do that. I didn't participate in that, and this is where I was born. And every Native American who is born in the United States is born in the United States just like I was born in the United States, right? This is the situation we find ourselves in. And so but it would be wrong for me to be in the military and go invade Canada, right? And so it would be wrong for Cornelius to have done that. Now, what should he do, right? He should refuse to do it and suffer the consequences, even to the point of death, because we should obey God rather than man. So even though we can participate in all of these different forms of authority that God has ordained, we should never participate in them in a way that would go against the will of God. And that's what I would say about that situation.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is for John. Why did Jesus tell Peter to put away his sword, and that the one who lives by the sword will die by the sword?
So it was a common problem amongst the Jews to kind of be fanatical and to want to rise up against the government and overthrow the government and that kind of thing. And in the New Testament is very clear that that's not okay for Christians to do that. We're just not. So in that particular record with Peter, there's a couple of things going on. One is that Peter has taken out his sword and has attacked a legitimate authority, right? These guys who've come to arrest Jesus, it's not like they were criminals who are going to try and kidnap him for ransom or something like that, right? This is a legitimate government authority. Now, they may be doing something bad, but it's a legitimate government authority, and we're just not supposed to rise up against legitimate government authority in that way. And so then you have that aspect, and then you have the bigger aspect, which is, once again, Peter finds himself at odds with the plan of God, right? So it's that Jesus is supposed to get arrested, and Peter is interfering with that. So he's supposed to put away his sword for both of those reasons. The second statement, those who live by the sword die by the sword, that again has to do with this idea that if you're trying to bring about this political change by the sword, you're going to die by the sword, right? That's almost certainly going to happen. And Jesus is telling him that's not what we're about. That's not what we're doing. Let me add something else that I think is a really important thing for people who kind of get into the mindset about rising up against the government, stuff like that. It's common to go to the American Revolution. But what they don't understand about the American Revolution is that was a legitimate government breaking ties with another government. So this wasn't just individuals deciding that they're going to revolt against the government, right? These were duly elected bodies by the people of those colonies, and those elected bodies they decided as a government entity to break ties with another government entity, which would certainly be within their right. So it's a very different kind of situation.
Okay, thank you. Carol, would you like to share?
Yeah, just to, sorry, so are you saying, John, that the colonies, the American colonies, were a government already, were a separate nation?
Well, they weren't a separate nation, but they were legitimate government entities, yes.
Okay, not part of the crown, the British crown.
Well,
they were colonies.
They were colonies, but they had elected bodies in those
Sure.
colonies. One of the things that happened in setting up those colonies is that they had a form of self-governance. And
Sure.
if you read through the Declaration of Independence, there's a whole lot of most of the Declaration of Independence is the list of reasons of why they were declaring independence. Many of those had to do with they had legitimately had these self-governing bodies that that were government entities of these territories, and collectively they were declaring their independence from the British Crown. So this, again, it wasn't just an individual deciding to revolt like Peter, sort of doing in that situation. This was a civil authority making this decision, which is within their right.
Well, okay, they're American colonies. Yes, they had their own governors and things like that, but obviously they were still part of the British Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I don't know if I agree with that. And since you brought up the American Revolution, there is a lot of evidence. And by the way, check this out, check the history. But the colonists, those people, the so-called founders of this country, the founding fathers, they did struggle with this issue of rebelling against the crown at the time. And there's a quote here, if I could quickly share this since it was brought up. This is from the Founders Bible. This was a gift that was given. But there's this interesting quote: "Could Christian rulers prohibit other Christians from following what they believe to be clear scriptural teachings? This question was addressed in American pulpits at the time. Many believed that God would not bless an offensive war. Illustrative of this belief was the famous command to the Lexington Minutemen, 'Do not fire unless fired upon.'" So I find this American Revolution history quite compelling. These people were biblicists. They were, a lot of them were Calvinists, and they were known for very studious Bible people. So I would ask people to look at the history there to see that there was a real
that's a great example, Carlos.
Struggle.
If you take those two, so you've got two sides. You've got the colonists and the British soldiers, right? In that situation, the British soldiers are the aggressors in that situation, and the colonists, because this is a militia, that they had a legal body that this wasn't just a ragtag group. This was an organized militia organized by that government. And so here come these British soldiers, and they're going to attack them, right? And so in that situation, the colonist soldiers are not only in the right, but you can see from that quote, they're doing the right thing in terms of God's will. The British soldiers are not. So if you're a Christian in the British regiment there, you should be refusing to do that.
Right. And just quickly on the question about Peter, what was the question again, Tracy? Sorry.
Let's see.
Why
did Peter? Why was he told to put away his sword?
Right.
And then the comment about if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword.
Right. So actually, Jesus rebukes Peter. In other words, he tells Peter, "You did something bad." I think simply because you're supposed to love your enemy. Jesus just taught them that, and then he teaches it through his own sufferings and torture and eventual death on the cross. And let's face it, the apostles were slow on the upswing, as we say. They were slow with the food laws. They were slow with things pertaining to the law of Moses. And this is a Mosaic thing, right? You had the God-ordained authority under the Old Covenant to protect yourself, even as through lethal means. But I think Paul eventually understood, and you can see this in his first letter, and I'll just quickly share here. 1 Peter 3, "Finally, all of you be like-minded, sympathetic, love as brothers, tender-hearted, humble. Do not repay evil with evil, insult with insult, but with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. that's the kingdom of God that's coming on earth, right? That's the blessing. And then he goes through a scripture here from I believe it's the Psalms, Psalm 34, about whoever would love life, see good days, and so on. I think that that later Peter would not have, and there is no evidence, by the way, that any of the followers of Jesus, especially his 12, ever carried weapons, and let alone enacted such injury to enemies. There's just no evidence. Most of them were martyred, and Peter, is he the one that was, according to tradition, John, upside down?
Yeah, crucified
upside down. So that Peter would never have done that, and I think he finally understood.
Let me give you a better example, I think,
yes.
to back up what you're saying, is that Paul talks about all the different sufferings that he's gone through. I want to say it's in Galatians, and it might be 2 Corinthians. And one of the things that he says is that, he's, been robbed multiple times, kind of thing. And, he's in danger of thieves or robbers, is I think what he says. And he might have even used the word for pirates, now that I'm thinking about it, which is almost worse. It's really kind of worse. And so, I mean, there's no evidence that Paul ever carried a sword. And here's the thing, is that as an apostle, and all the apostles, that was their calling. They weren't called into civil authority. They weren't called into those things. And they understood, I think, again, this is the key to this, and it gets a little tricky, is you have the right to self-defense. It doesn't mean that you have to use it, right? You have to use judgment in those situations. There is times where using self-defense is appropriate. Again, I don't think that's ever appropriate against government authorities. But in a criminal situation, it may be the right thing to do in a criminal situation in order maybe to protect the innocent. But you have, I go back to what we started off with, Carlos. Let's just not default to that. Let's default the other direction. Let's default to giving up our rights in order to try and save people.
Yeah, I believe that's the verse you were talking about, John.
Yeah, 2 Corinthians. I thought it was Galatians. I thought, no, that's 2 Corinthians.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, well, thank you, guys. Carlos, you had brought up Romans 13, and someone just posed the question about, do either of you think that Romans 13 contradicts other passages in the Bible? So if you want to just briefly comment on that.
I don't understand. If it contradicts,
I would say no. In fact, it's in direct alignment with other things, like Peter talks about the exact same thing, that we're supposed to be in submission to governing authorities.
Oh, right. In terms of let's see. Everyone must submit. Yes, I think the issue here has to do with who. Really, the question is, who should be the governing authorities that God is keeping order in this present evil age through? So that has been really the question tonight, and I don't think Christians should be anywhere near the governing authorities being described here, because their actions, their role as God ordained, and it is true, it's God ordained, established by God, but their role, just to me, clearly contradicts the lifestyle that a follower of Messiah is supposed to have. So, but I agree with John that the Christian principle is to obey the authorities as far as possible. By the way, you would agree, John, obviously, that if they tell us to do things contrary to, what God and Jesus say, obviously we have to stand up there.
Yeah. Don't preach the gospel anymore.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nope.
All righty. So
Yeah.
this next question, if you can figure it out, if the context of Matthew 5:21 through 26 is about murder, shouldn't Matthew 5:38 be the context for not resisting the evil person? The instances Jesus points out is when a person can be legally stomped on, and it's the command that's referenced is for the individual, not the government. So I don't know if either of you have any comments on that.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I didn't follow the whole question, but I think, just in commenting on the last piece of it, I would agree that Jesus is not preaching to the government, and he's not dealing with government authority, rights, and responsibilities in the Sermon on the Mount. He's talking to kingdom people, as kingdom people, what they're supposed to be like, and he's giving them examples. So I don't really think... I don't think the Sermon on the Mount pertains to government authority, other than to say that when a Christian is in a position of government authority, they still need to be a kingdom person. And sometimes that means that they should give up a right, or they should, suffer in order to do something, in order to not do something that would be very wrong.
Okay, Carlos?
Yeah, the question, let's see, I'll just deal with the murder versus killing part, because I think there's a misconception there too. In other words, Jesus says do not murder, but he doesn't say just don't kill in general. In other words, don't take a life. I don't think there's a difference. I mean, it's all taking a life. And just on taking the life of the enemy, I think you said, John, earlier that we give up our rights, right, in order to get the enemy, to save the enemy, right? Well, if we're in the role of the state, again, if we go back to the topic at hand of if I'm a soldier or in the law enforcement, and sometimes you have to take the life of an enemy, you're forfeiting their chance, as it were, to repent perhaps and be saved. So that's why I think it's inconsistent for me to be a police person or a military person involved in that, in that function, because then I would, I would not be giving that person the chance perhaps to repent and be saved. So if you take their lives, so.
Okay, thank you.
The thing is that you're going to have situations where, you don't really have any choice in that. If you can, that's what you want to do. But there's going to be situations where that other person hasn't given you any choice. You don't have the choice. So, for example, just in a ridiculous scenario, you come into a room in the middle of, you're in Atlanta, in the middle of Atlanta, and they've got a nuclear bomb and they've got a button and they're getting ready to push that button, and you have a gun, and the only thing that you can do to stop them from pushing that button is shoot them, right? So now you have to weigh, I don't want to kill somebody, so I don't want to shoot him, so he doesn't, but he's going to push the button, or I shoot him and kill him, but then he doesn't push the button and kill 1 million people, right? When you exaggerate like that, you can start to see the concept. Okay, yeah, it's not black and white. It's that there has to be judgment. In that particular thing, it is a much greater good, it is much greater love to shoot that guy than it is to not shoot that guy. And so, you can see from that example that you take that down a whole lot of notches, and you can still be in those situations. Cops are in those situations every single day where they would much rather the person just get on the ground so they could put handcuffs on them and put them in a car and take them to the jail so that maybe this can all get worked out, than to shoot them. But the person might not give them any choice.
So before Carlos responds to your response, that's similar to a question that was asked. So I'll read this and then Carlos can respond to this. if someone breaks into your Sunday church service and starts shooting, would you defend your brothers and sisters by stopping the killing going on? And so you can respond to that, and what John said, it's similar.
Yes. So let me see. Just got a note here. So I want to be clear for our audience. The position I am presenting here is not saying that not to do anything. So unfortunately, this view, what I would regard as the New Testament nonviolence view, has been misunderstood as total pacifism. In other words, you're the proverbial rug. People can just walk all over you. So you're just going to let evil run rampant. No, not at all. I would say that it's evil. It's actually evil. And I would say, even as a pastor teacher, a sin, not to try to protect the innocent and yourself. I would even go to that length. So, I mean, it's stupid to me not to try and preserve my life. It's
Could
just
you
stupid.
explain a little bit, Carlos, what you mean by that? Because most people's mind is thinking shooting the guy to protect that, or killing them. How would you go about trying to protect yourself or somebody else without using lethal force or something?
Right. So that's the eternal question. And that's what I was getting at. But just to finish my previous point about not doing anything, Jesus never says that. Jesus is very active. He's teaching active, practical principles, turn the other cheek, walk a mile, walk two, and so on. During the time of tribulation in Matthew 24, he says, flee. He doesn't say, oh, well, give yourself up for me. And, so Jesus is a very active, non-violence teacher. But that is the question. So how do we go about it? Well, you do your best. You do your best to protect the innocent and yourself, obviously. I will not carry a weapon. I think when Jesus rebuked Peter, he, as the early Christians believed, when Jesus rebuked Peter, he rebuked all Christians. That was the saying in the early church. I think that's true. So I would not own weapons to protect myself or my family, because that also shows, by the way, I hear this a lot. So guns at home, right? Yeah, but you didn't mean to shoot the person that broke in, or you didn't mean, then why did you get the weapons? So there's already you're already, I think, at fault if you're already owning weapons for the purpose of defending yourself, which could lead to you killing someone. So that already shows intent. I think that's the legal term. So I wouldn't do that. But again, just to answer your question, just try anything and everything possible. Talking to the person. Probably the last thing is some kind of force, some kind of restraint. But even that, I'm not sure, just to be frank, because I don't see anywhere in the New Testament anyone teaching that, or I don't see them practicing that. And lastly, I would say that I forgot what I was going to say, but I'll give it to John. Yeah, I'll give it to John.
So it's an interesting question, and I'll just say this. So I have a black belt in a Japanese form of jiu-jitsu and a blue belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and I've studied martial arts most of my adult life, and I can tell you the very, very best self-defense is leave. That is the very best self-defense. Just leave. Just get out of there. In fact, I had a PE class in college that I took last semester, and I had to take one, and I'm looking through the catalog, and I see there's a self-defense class, and I was a black belt by that point, and I'm like, hey, there's an easy class. And it was taught by a graduate student that didn't know anything about any martial arts and stuff like that. But he's just teaching out of the book. And the book was, the training in the book, the number one training was run laps. because if you could outrun the assailant, you're fine. And, so, and we were always taught that, that's one of the things about that particular form of martial art, jiu-jitsu, is the idea of using minimal amount of force necessary to restrain, deal with the situation, that sort of thing. And I've had a couple of times where I had to use that stuff, and that's exactly how it went down. I didn't hurt the person. I just restrained them, and the situation diffused itself at that point. And so, yeah, I think that's as much as possible. We're told to be at peace with all men. There will be times where it's not possible, and then it becomes, okay, well, now that it's not possible for me to be at peace, how can I, as much as possible, not harm this person? How can I, as much as possible, still love them even when there's not going to be peace?
Okay, so this is similar to what you've been talking about. I'm going to combine two questions together. We have a few left. The question is pacifism biblical? You've addressed it a little bit. And then, does the law of Jehovah provide the right for self-defense and defense of property? John, would you like to go?
Sure. Okay, so certainly defense of self. Yeah, I don't think you can say that God didn't give us that right. I think absolutely we have that right. But property is a different issue altogether. I we talked about carjacking. Don't kill someone because they're stealing your car, right? Just give them the car. And even with your home, it's like, okay, someone's breaking into your home. If you can, leave, get out, right? If you can't, then, you're going to have to deal with that situation. But if you can, don't kill them. You're going to have to live with that for the rest of your life. Don't do that. I have a friend who's a doctor who lives alone, and his house kept getting broken into when he would be away. And so he was home one night when his truck wasn't out front. And so, the same people, looked and saw, oh, he's not here. And they broke into the house in the middle of the night. Well, he was home and he heard them coming in. And so he's upstairs and there's a set of stairs going down to the front door. And so he hops up out of bed and he grabs his shotgun and he walks around the corner, and there's these three people coming up the stairs, and he cycles the chamber. And that's all he does. They turn white and they run out the door, and they never bothered him again, right? I thought, that's really great. I don't even know if he had ammo in the gun, right? They just, he didn't hurt anybody. He didn't hurt them. And they hopefully learned their lesson. And I think that's really, really good. So, something that you can do in those kind of situations, whatever it is, to try and diffuse or, I don't think I don't think we should ever harm someone over property. People are valuable, property is not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. One question I have to your response was, well, not really a question, but statistically, I think, though, don't they say that usually the attacker is the one that's going to get you if you pull a gun? Most likely that not the person, if you're attacking me and I pull a gun, usually it's used on me, or you're going to do something to me before that.
I don't think so. The statistics show that most things involving a gun, where the victim has a gun, end in nonviolence. There's no shooting that occurs, and it stops the crime, and that's a good thing. I don't, as long as that's better than any alternative, right? But I would say that, you have to be prepared in those situations. This is one of the things that I think is really important to understand about this whole subject. When that happens, you get attacked. Whatever you are thinking you would do in that situation, you're probably not going to do, right? Your amygdala is going to take over and you're going to fight, freeze, or flee, right? Those are the three things that it's going to do. And the only thing that will change that situation is training. If you've had enough training for those situations, for that kind of stuff, then you will do your training. Your amygdala is still going to take over, but you're going to do your training, right? And so you don't really have control in those situations. And so I believe that you really shouldn't have a firearm, carrying around a firearm, stuff like that, unless you are willing to do a lot of training with it for the reason that you talked about, because it's probably going to end up being used on you, as opposed to if you've had a lot of training, then your training is going to kick in and you may stop that situation without hurting yourself or the other person. But you got to have training, or otherwise.
Well, in training, don't they usually train to shoot to kill, basically? Shoot the heart? They're not shooting at people.
Necessarily. No, I mean, yeah, sure, you could train that anytime that happens, you're just going to shoot. That would be a dumb idea, because you're probably going to go to jail, because something's going to happen, that training's going to kick in, and you're going to kill somebody, and you're going to go to jail, right? If you're going to train in those situations, you need to train in a way that's appropriate, right? Yes, if the guy's on top of you, trying to stab you with a knife, okay, you're gonna shoot them. But if the guy's breaking in your house, there's a lot of places where if they break into your house and you just shoot them, you're going to go to jail. And so it's not a good idea to train that way.
Mm-hmm. Carlos, do you want to comment on this? And do you know of any verses that would tell us that, yes, there is a proof for self-defense of just yourself or of your property, or if pacifism is biblical?
Yeah, as far as I know, in the New Testament, which is my standard, under the New Testament, New Covenant laws of Jesus and the apostles, there just is not, especially for lethal self-defense. And this is the issue, that in order to be consistent as a follower of the Messiah Christ and the apostles, and the way they understood what he taught, and then how Jesus is teaching people like Paul post-resurrection, I just don't see anywhere in the... Now, people point to the violence of the coming tribulation, of the parousia, the second coming. They point to, well, Jesus says, bring my enemies before me and slaughter them in Luke 19, I believe. Well, true, but that's when Jesus comes. The first time he came as a sheep. He came as the lamb. He comes as the suffering servant. He doesn't even bruise a reed, says Isaiah, right? But then he's coming back as the Lion of Judah, of course. So at this present evil age, we're supposed to emulate as far as we can, as John says, as far as it's possible within your means, to live at peace with everyone. And just quickly, since we moved now from the church and state to the self-defense issue, this is a little thing I did a while back. Maybe it might help someone. The ABCs, I call it, of how to resist evil without disobeying Jesus by killing your enemy. So you have be active or active, flee from evil, Matthew 24:16. I was referring to that during the tribulation days. Be creative, try to talk reason your way out of evil. I think John spoke to that. And call the authorities if you can. And see Paul in Acts 25:26. Paul appealed to the Roman state to help them at times against his own people, by the way, against Jewish mobs that were after him. So,
okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a couple
Christi,
more. This is not per se a question, but
hey Tracy, before we go on, I want to say something. I like the ABCs thing that he just presented, and I think one of the things as Christians that we need to recognize is that the current culture in popular entertainment is glorifying revenge. and oh, you didn't get justice through the court system for the death of your child or your spouse or whatever, so take it out on and they're very entertaining movies. I think of the John Wick movies, for instance, very entertaining. But if you take the John Wick movie, okay, so here's this ex-assassin who retired from that, but then his wife dies from cancer or whatever, and so what do the bad guys do? They kill his dog and take his car, and so he then proceeds to kill hundreds of people. Is that really what we want to glorify in terms of us? That the whole idea of the revenge, taking our own revenge, is very popular right now, and that Christians should just say, that's not right.
Mm-hmm. Sure. This next one is not really a question, but they were commenting, and so if you two would briefly comment on this. The verse that talks about if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially members of his own household, they've denied the faith and is worse than a believer. Would that include providing protection physically, like from an attacker?
I can go further. Again, I would reiterate what I said. It's evil, if not a sin, to do your best to protect the innocent. And that means feed people and house people. And I mean, that's the point of loving your enemy. Stories with Jesus, right? With the Good Samaritan, the person who's on the road and everyone just walks by. And of course, so everyone, including your own flesh and blood, obviously. So you do the best you can to the best of your ability. But again, my stake, as Anthony says, is firmly planted on that lethal, especially obviously lethal violence. So I'll do whatever I can. And I think we forget that there's always the ultimate sacrifice we can make. If you really love your family and friends and the innocent and so on, sometimes, and you might have to give your life. Are you prepared to do that instead of killing them? I mean, that is very Christ-like to do that. And I think the church as a whole has lost that sort of martyred, what do I call it? The martyrdom spirit, the spirit of the martyr that obviously prevailed in the first at least 4 centuries of the Christian movement.
Mm-hmm. John, what would you have to say on that?
Can you repeat that? I didn't quite follow.
It's the verse that talks about if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially members of his own household, then he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. It's talking more about the food and all that, taking care of them, but the person is asking the question, do you think that it works together with protecting them physically, like what we're talking about here, even though it's not stated in the verse?
I mean, I guess. I don't like necessarily expanding a scripture like that beyond what the context is really getting at. Because here's the problem. Here's what I would say is that, yeah, I think it's appropriate to protect your family, for instance. That's appropriate. And a lot of that is avoiding situations that would put them in danger. That's most of it, right? And so if you're putting your family into situations that are dangerous, well, okay, that's, then yeah, that I think this would apply to you, right? And but at the same time, I don't think that you would say if somebody broke into your house and you didn't just immediately shoot them, you tried to diffuse the situation and it went poorly, and maybe one of your family members got killed. I don't think you would say, well, then you were an unbeliever because you didn't protect your family. That doesn't seem right to me either.
Okay, well, thanks. We have 2 questions here left. This one is for John. God does take our word very seriously. If we give our word, we take an oath. how can a Christian make an oath to obey the government or the military? Because if you do, there really isn't an option to refuse an order if you gave your word or took an oath to obey them, even if it's going against something that God did.
Well, I would say that's just not true. Absolutely, you can refuse to obey an ungodly order. And like I said, you may suffer for it. And if you do, then that's the right thing to do. So I mean, I don't know of an oath, at least in the United States anyway, I don't know of an oath that a police officer is going to take, or a judge, or whoever is going to take, that's going to say something like, I promise to do evil things. So I don't see a problem with that.
I don't think it's questioning if they're doing evil things, just to obey, the point of obedience, because you took an oath to obey.
Sure. So when you go in the military, you take an oath, and but that doesn't mean that it's okay for you to obey an order that's an evil order, even though you did take an oath. Doesn't matter, right? So what? Disobey the order. Refuse to do it and suffer the consequences for that, because that's right. So I would say the problem in the statement, in the question or whatever, is the idea that I don't have any choice. Yes, I do have a choice, right? I didn't take an oath to do something evil. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution, to obey my superiors. But even in the military, in the United States anyway.
Anya, come turn my phone off, please, right away.
You in the military code, you don't have to obey an unlawful order, right? You can refuse to do that. So I don't see that as a problem.
Yeah, I would say, yeah. You can, by the way, mute yourself if you need to.
I couldn't find the mute. I'm sorry.
I'll mute you. I would say the most practical thing would be not to put yourself in that situation, not to serve two masters. I mean, that's the most practical, common sense thing, which is what I love about our faith, that Jesus was a practical man. He taught very profound spiritual truths, but he was also very practical about it, wasn't he? Like, okay, if the enemy wants you to do this, the state, the soldier will, do it as far as possible. Flee from evil. I like your response, John, about your previous response about self-defense. Just, leave. Take yourself out of that situation. So that's my brief answer, Tracy.
Okay, well, thank you. The last one, this is mine, and in reference to Hebrews 11:36 through 37, it says, and others experienced mockings, floggings, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, sawed apart, murdered with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins. They were destitute, afflicted, and ill-treated. Where is the line between suffering and sacrifice like that and what we're talking about tonight? John, if you'd like to answer that first, that'd be great.
Sure. And I remember we covered this a little bit in the beginning, but in the video that Carlos referenced that's on our YouTube channel, that's called The Use of Force, I make a distinction between the use of force against the government and the use of force against criminal activity, right? And so I don't believe that we should use force against the government, even if they are doing bad things, right? It doesn't mean that you don't do anything. I like, Carlos, you talked about it tonight, and you've referenced it in some of your other materials. Absolutely not, right? We should stand, right? And we should try to do whatever we can do. But I don't think that we should use violence against our government, even if we think that they're doing something evil. And so in this context, that's what's happening. These people are being persecuted. And the other distinction that I make in that teaching that I think is very important is also not using violence against the society including a mob, right? That, that's not that's not the same thing as a criminal trying to kidnap your child or something like that, right? That the society has decided that, you're a Christian and we don't like you, and so we're going to come and burn your house down, with you in it. Well, I don't think you should use violence against that mob, right? That I don't believe that we're, as Christians, that's something that we should do. That
my understanding is, so like, let's just take this being sawn apart or stoning. If someone evil person is going to saw you apart and they're just a mean, bad person, you would say it's justified to kill them or to wound them to stop that. But if the government was coming to do that to you, or a mob of angry people, that you should then allow yourself to be persecuted in that situation?
I would say the second part of that, yeah, I would agree with that a government or the mob, I'm going to try and flee. I'm going to try to get out of there. But if I can't and I'm being persecuted, I'm not going to use violence against them, right? In the other situation is way trickier, right? Do I have the right of self-defense in that situation? I believe so, but I'm not necessarily going to use that right. In that situation, I might use force to protect the innocent, because maybe it's not me that criminal is trying to kill or wound or whatever. But this is why the default thing, I think, is so important. In that situation, I don't think there's an answer. I think there's a default, which for us should always be to try to bring Christ into that situation. In the teaching, the use of force teaching, towards the end of it, I read a story about a lady in Atlanta who was basically kidnapped by an escaped criminal who killed a couple of officers, and he, takes her into her apartment where he's basically holding her hostage, and so I kind of run through a scenario where maybe she had a gun in that, and maybe she could have gotten access to that gun and shot him, right? And I don't think most people would have ever batted an eye if that had been the story, right? Oh yeah, he did that and shot those cops, and she was able to, and probably be a lot of people cheering her in that situation, right? But that's not what she did at all. And what she did was amazing. She brought Christ into that man's life and got him to turn himself back into the police and to give his life to Christ. I mean, that's so much better, right? She defaulted to that. Now, maybe she had to because she didn't have any choice, but it doesn't matter, right? That's what she did. And that's what I think we should default to, even in those situations. It doesn't, but it's not black and white. I'm not saying that that's 100% of the time, that if somebody did something different in a different situation, that they were necessarily bad and wrong and sinned. I'm just saying, let's default to the other one as much as we possibly can.
Okay, I just have one other question before I'll let Carlos speak here. Is there, maybe you touched on this, but is there a specific verse? You've said several times tonight that we have a right to self-defense, or is that just from putting different things together? Is there a verse that says that, or are you taking that from government or the Bible, or where is the right, actually having a right to self-defense?
There's two ways to get to that. One is to show that it is not right, and it's wicked, and it's wrong, and it's sin for a person to attack and kill another person who is innocent, right? And this person is in the wrong. A person defending themselves is not in the wrong, because the other person is not innocent in that situation.
Right, but is that a verse? Is there like a verse that says we have?
I'm thinking of, for example, in Genesis 9, when he's setting up civil authority, and he says that, go there. I don't know if I had one in this. Do that. Let me see here. Yeah. He says, in verse 6, whoever sheds human blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made mankind. That the idea is that man is now responsible for dealing with this situation. And at a very, very basic level, that goes down to the individual, but not in a revenge sense, in a sense of protecting himself. But let me give you the other way to get to this, is that this is given into societies, right? That this is an authority of the society, the governing authority. And in some cultures and some governments, and certainly this is true in the United States, that authority is extended down to the individual as a right in those situations. So you and I in the United States don't have the right to go take vengeance. Like somebody robbed us, so we go over and we beat them, or somebody killed your child, so you go kill them, right? Or kill their child or something like that. We don't have that right in the United States. But we are extended the right that if someone is attacking us, that we can defend ourselves. That's a right that we have in the United States. The governing authority has extended that right down to the individual. So there's sort of two ways that I would get to that. It's a good question, though. I think I don't think I'm doing that question justice. So I may get back to you on that, Tracy.
Okay. Well, thank you, John. Carlos, would you like to?
Yeah, we're back.
Comments here before we end.
Yeah, just to follow up on the question about one verse. Well, again, as Christians, our standard should be the New Testament, New Covenant laws of Jesus and his apostles. And nowhere there do we find Jesus or his apostles teaching that you either should arm yourselves in order to, if need be, kill the enemy. If anything, Jesus says the complete opposite: love your enemy, or anything like that. And I'll just quickly point to the situation in the end days, in the, as we approach the end of this present evil age. Revelation 13, the beast was permitted to wage war against the saints. That's us, Christians. He was given authority. Listen to that. He was given authority, right, by God ultimately, over tribes, people, tongues, nation, over all the nations, all who dwelled on the earth. And then I want to get to verse 9. He who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, into captivity he will go. If anyone is to die by the sword he must be killed. Now you can say, well, this is just for one section of the church, maybe. I don't think so. Here is a call for the perseverance and faith of the saints, plural. To me, that's all of us Christians. So we could be martyred in the end days. And there's no such thing as, well, you can defend yourself, even to the point of killing the enemy. And in this case, people that are coming from this beast, the power that this Antichrist figure will have in the end. So there is no such teaching. So I hope that answers that.
Tracy, yes. Tracy, something that I should mention in terms of, because something Carlos said, I wouldn't want to be misunderstood. The covenant in Genesis 9 is still in effect for all of mankind, including Christians. And the reason that we know that is in Acts 15, when the apostles and the elders are trying to wrangle with the questions about what to do with these Gentiles. They actually use part of this covenant in terms of what they're going to tell the Gentiles they still have to do, which has to do with the blood. You're not allowed to eat blood. That comes from this covenant. And so the fact that they're still, well, okay, don't do this, right? That you can see it's still in effect today. So just a comment.
Okay, well, thank you. I would like to thank everybody who joined us live and for your great questions. And obviously, I thank you, John and Carlos, for being willing to discuss this important topic. And I would like to end by saying that the one thing I think we can all agree upon is that we're told to pray for those in power and who lead the country. And we should remember to do that if we think of it as we think of it, especially over these next 4 years. And we still need to respect the position, even if we have different opinions and things like that in terms of leadership. And we are called to a higher calling to strive to be like Christ. And so I thank you both, gentlemen, and I invite you both. We'll start with John for a short closing remark as we end, and then Carlos can finish up.
Well, we've said a lot tonight. We're already at 2 hours, so I won't take very much time. I can't agree with you more, Tracy, that, as Christians, again, our defaults should be praying for people and loving people and giving up our rights in order to save someone if we're able to do that. And I think that absolutely there's the question of what side do we err on? Do we err on the side of, well, okay, pacifism seems extreme, and so I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to, carry around a gun and shoot somebody and, and talk about it. And, if they come in, they try to take my car, they're coming to my house, I'm going to shoot them dead and stuff like that. Okay, well, I don't think you're going in the wrong direction. And so if I'm comparing that to someone who is trying to say, no, I don't think Christians should do any of this ever, I'm going to say, even though I would disagree with that position, I would say they're closer to Jesus and his commandments than the other person is. So I think we need to get really good at loving our enemies. We need to get really good at loving everyone, right? We need to get good at not quarreling with people and praying for people who may persecute us or, whatever, and praying for government authority, even when we think that they're doing something wrong and bad. Because how much better is it if we're praying for that person and there's peace and it goes well, and maybe they're even converted like Saul was converted. So I think that's the mindset that we need to cultivate, and not the mindset of, violence and, those kinds of things that, I've got a right and I'd use it. Let's set that aside. And yeah, maybe you do, but so what? Let's focus on what Christ has called us to, which is to love people and to even our enemies and even those who persecute us. And I just want to say thank you to Carlos. This has been a great discussion, and I love it. Absolutely love the discussion.
Thank you for taking. My goodness, we went over 2 hours already. So thank you for your time, John. I know you're busy. Thank you.
So Carlos, would you like to
say
goodbye?
Yes, thank you, Tracy. And I'll just make this appeal to everyone to closely hear what John said, and I can wholly agree with his default should be trying to win the enemy by giving up our rights. I think we're almost there, John. We're at the point where when I heard you say that about the default, I said, wow, that's how I started my Christian walk. I have a default of violence in me. I have been doing this job that now that I call myself a follower of the Messiah Christ, I should really not do. But that was a personal thing. I know we all have to, as Paul says, be convinced in your own minds about these things. So that's all we're trying to do here. And I appreciate John, because we're trying to get us all to the one spirit of unity, right? The one spirit of faith, the bond of peace. So we're all striving to do that. I just want to end with this passage here in Romans 8 and appeal to you to listen to the apostle here. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, or the sword? As it is written, For your sake, we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, angels, principalities, the present, the future, any powers, height, depth, or anything else in all of creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus, our Lord. These are powerful words. And I hope you can think about these things. It's not easy. Christianity is not an easy thing. And that's why we signed to Christianity, because we want to be courageous as he was courageous. It's a courageous thing to stand for nonviolence. It doesn't take a coward to love their enemy. It actually takes a very courageous person to love your enemy. Think about that. It's easy just to grab a weapon, grab a gun nowadays, and just shoot someone dead, maybe. So that's the easy way out. Christ showed us the true way that changes hearts and minds. Some people who most of us might even disagree with theologically or otherwise, like Gandhi, like Martin Luther King, they sort of showed the world that love of Christ, that sacrificial love. And this is something that the church has lost. It had it once for many centuries when the church started. It had the spirit of martyrdom, but that spirit is gone. We need to regain that spirit, win people by giving up our rights, as John said, and I wholly agree with that statement. Thank you, Tracy, and thank you once again to John for your time tonight. God bless.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you, Carlos.
Tracy, you want to close it up?
Oh, sure, I can do that. Thank you all for joining us, and let's just close with prayer, and we will finish up tonight. So thank you, Father, for this time of discussion, and that we still have the opportunity to speak what we think, and that we can have a civil discussion even when we disagree on things. And I ask that that would be an example to the world around us. I ask that you would please be with the leaders here in America as they move forward, that they would somehow humble themselves and turn to you, Father. But we do know that the time is coming when there's a lot of things that need to happen for Jesus to return, and we look forward to that day. I ask that you would help all of us to strive to be more like Jesus with every day, and be willing to give up our rights and even our lives for living in obedience to what he said, just as he did in obedience to you. And I thank you, and I just ask that you would bless those that hear this, and that you would draw us closer to your truths. In Jesus' name, amen.